Okay, hi. So in this presentation I'm going to be talking about visualizing rave music in virtual reality and thinking about symbolic and interactive approaches in relation to my project Cyberdream VR, which is a music visualization for the Oculus Quest. So to briefly outline the context for the work that I'm doing here, the area of visualizing music is an area that I'm thinking about as encompassing areas such as visual music painting, visual music filmmaking, but also the wider sphere of audiovisual performances and practices that are related to creating visuals that go with sound and music in one form or another. So this might include things like psychedelic light shows, things like generative music visualizations, so stuff like Jeff Minter's virtual light machine on the Atari Jaguar, and later on other consoles such as the Xbox, things like VJ performance, and also we have some interesting work recently using technologies such as augmented reality and mixed reality and virtual reality, which is exploring the visualization of music using these technologies. So we can think about the question of how visuals may relate to music. So in a lot of the visual music films, we find that visuals correspond with musical features such as pitch, rhythm, harmonies, or textures. So this might be, for example, Oscar Fischinger's work, where you have things like spheres which are moving around on the screen, and other abstract forms where the movement of those abstract forms is related to abstract musical features such as pitch and melody. But we can also think about how, whilst visual music films and the kind of classic works in that area at least are often generated using composed forms for fixed media work, later on we find that it's possible to create these kind of correspondences through forms of audio reactivity. And we see this a lot in more recent forms of VJ performance, where people may be using software like Resolume or VDMX, where you can do forms of FFT frequency analysis, for example, and then you can link properties of the audio signal to properties of the visuals. So you could have things kind of filters kind of changing their properties, or shapes moving in correspondence with the audio signal. But there's also the possibility, and this is something which I've been thinking about a lot in relation to my own work, there's also the possibility to think about symbolic, conceptual, or representational correspondences between sound and music. And the way that I like to describe this is actually with reference to the genre of surf rock, which was a particular style of rock and roll music which was popular in the 1960s. And surf rock is interesting because the whole genre is a form of rock and roll which is related to the concept of surfing. And we find that this is can be seen through things like the album covers, so pictures of people surfing. You have descriptions of surfing and surfing culture, often on the back of the record sleeves on the LPs. We can also have things like, sometimes there's recordings of sounds of waves and things on the music, and various other sonic properties are used, such as kind of wet sounds of echo and reverb, which Peter Doyle talks about in his work on echo and reverb in popular music. So you have, both in terms of the sound and the visual representations, you have an embedded concept of surfing which is kind of established and reinforced through patterns of use over time. So basically this is an example of how we can think about the idea that you might be able to design visuals in which you're drawing upon these kind of symbolic or conceptual representations. So a visualization of surf rock might have images of surfing, for example. And this is a kind of different way of thinking about music visualizations, which focuses less on abstract qualities such as pitch and melody, for example. So this is the approach that I've been thinking about using with my project Cyberdream VR. So Cyberdream is a prototype VR music visualization. It's been made in Unity, which is a video game engine. So in Cyberdream, you can fly through a synesthetic dreamscape of electronic music. And with this piece, I'm kind of exploring VJ aesthetics, but translating these into virtual reality. So I'm visualizing rave music and vaporwave, essentially. And what the piece also aims to do is to allow users to interactively paint with sound, using audiovisual sound toys within virtual reality. So the original version was for the Gear VR. This was presented at several events, including Sci-Fi London, which is a sci-fi film festival in London, which has a immersive experiences category. It was also included in the Event 2 exhibition, organised by the Computer Arts Society and Flux, and also the Audio Mostly conference. So later on in 2020, I developed a new version for the Oculus Quest, and the main developments which I added here were the interactive features of audiovisual sound toys, which I'll talk more about in a second, and also using the Wise middleware software. So Wise is a game audio middleware tool, and it allows me to do more interesting things with the sound in the newer version. So the visual references for Cyberdream are coming from the surrealistic and futuristic early computer graphics of early 90s rave culture, as seen through things like record sleeves, rave flyers and VJ performances from that time. And these are also explored to an extent by the more recent form Vaporwave, which is an internet-based music genre which remixes 80s and 90s corporate music, elevator music and pop in order to create slightly surrealistic, often technologically themed and capitalist themed experiences of ambient sound. And there's a very definite style that goes along with Vaporwave, which is exploring early computer graphics, and there's similarities, I think, with some aspects of the visuals of rave culture. So I'm kind of drawing upon both of these areas to an extent. And the background for Cyberdream was my earlier work doing VJ performances, where I was already kind of exploring these sorts of aesthetics through the visuals I was using. But what I'm doing now with Cyberdream is translating this stuff into virtual reality. So I'm going to play a clip now, hopefully, of Cyberdream so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so this gives you a little bit of a flavour of what the piece looks like, and there is a extended version of that video that is on YouTube, which I'll make the link to available. So I like to describe the design or the composition of this piece in terms of the macro structure and the microstructural elements that fit within it. So the macro structure comes from symbolic environments, which, as I say, are kind of drawing on this idea of having different representational scenes that relate to the conceptual themes and the visual language of rave music and vaporwave. So each audiovisual environment has a corresponding electronic music soundtrack, which I've composed for this project. And basically you fly through a series of scenes, which you can sort of see postcards from in the slide here. And as you go through each scene, that has a particular music track associated with it. And between the scenes, you fade into the next one, and the music crossfades in synchronization into the next track, and you move into the next visual scene as well. So the music unfolds kind of like a DJ mix, but so do the visuals. So as you transition between tracks, you're also transitioning between visuals, and the two are basically one. So the scene order can also be randomized as well, and that's something that I'm exploring. So you essentially have a kind of generated DJ VJ mix each time you play it. So I also use quite a lot of wave effects, and this is technically designed using C# scripts. So you have basically oscillating sine waves, which are used to manipulate the size and color of cubes, and this draws upon a kind of demo scene technique of creating plasma effects, which are created with these kind of wave patterns, but in this case it's kind of translating this into individual cubes. So that's something that I incorporate, and I like the use of wave effects because I think they also add a kind of feeling of musicality to the piece. So this is the kind of macro structure, and then the micro structure within this comes from the interactive audiovisual sound toys, which allows you to essentially create your own sounds and visuals over the top of this DJ VJ experience. And this slide is just kind of showing you the controls, which are provided through the two Oculus Touch controllers on the Oculus Quest. And here this is just kind of showing you a little bit about the Wise implementation. So Wise is game audio middleware software which allows you to do more sophisticated things more easily in terms of the sound and music in Unity. And essentially what I'm doing with Wise is I'm using Unity to trigger sound effects and music, but Wise is also sending callbacks to the Unity engine, which means I can get synchronization information with things like tempo and when beats are occurring. And this means that I can trigger the sound toys if I want to in synchronization with the music. And Wise is also allowing me to crossfade the different music tracks and things as well. So all of that occurs in the form of a DJ mix. So at the moment there's 3 sound toys, and so we have Zigzag Toy, which emits orange laser beams that twist in time with the music and emit percussive pulses. These are programmed using binary patterns, where ones are beats and a 0 is no beat, so it's kind of like a simple step sequencer. Manipulating the thumbstick changes the sound width and color of the beam, and you can switch between patterns using the secondary trigger. And this allows you to, between the two controllers, create interlocking patterns. Circle Toy is one which creates asynchronous pulse sounds with a green beam that moves in a rotating arc. Once again, you can use the thumbstick to change the sound of these, and the spatialization changes depending on where you point the beam. And Streamer Toy emits atonal drones and yellow lightning that follows hand movement. The thumbstick changes the sound of the drone and the width and color of the lightning. 3D spatialization of the sound changes based on the location of the lightning. And that's it. That's the piece so far. So I'll be interested to hear people's thoughts and feedback. Thank you.
Morning everyone. Maybe it's not morning. Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Knight Hill and I'm here to talk to you about my ideas of audiovisual space. This is a project that is currently in development. I've just been very fortunate enough to receive support from the AHRC to continue this research, so I will be working on this a lot more over the next 2 years. But I'm going to just go over some of the ideas which I covered in the book chapter that I wrote for our recent Sound and Image Aesthetics and Practices volume, which has lots of other contributions from many of the other speakers at this event. Great, so we don't have much time, so let's dive straight in. So when we talk about audiovisuality, often what we're doing is we're conceptualizing the relationships between sound and image in temporal terms. We talk about points of synchronization. We talk about counterpoint. We talk in film contexts, as in narrative film context, about diegetic sound, which by its very definition is constructed through temporal congruence. But what I'm interested in is, does this actually reflect our true experience of the audiovisual work? How might thinking spatially contribute to our understandings of the audiovisual? And can spatial concepts reveal some unattended assumptions upon which certain theories are based? So I've been looking at a wide range of thinkers from film sound, electroacoustic music, sound arts and experimental film, and I've come across lots of different perspectives which I think kind of try and weave this together. Here's an example. Kalanak quotes, "While the film was projected from the rear of the hall to the screen at the front, so music was projected backwards over the audience, and through a kind of transference or slippage between sound and image, the depth..." Morning everyone. Maybe it's not morning. Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Knight Hill and I'm here to talk to you about my ideas of audiovisual space. This is a project that is currently in development. I've just been very fortunate enough to receive support from the AHRC to continue this research, so I will be working on this a lot more over the next 2 years. But I'm going to just go over some of the ideas which I covered in the book chapter that I wrote for our recent Sound and Image Aesthetics and Practices volume, which has lots of other contributions from many of the other speakers at this event. Great, so we don't have much time, so let's dive straight in. So when we talk about audiovisuality, often what we're doing is we're conceptualizing the relationships between sound and image in temporal terms. We talk about points of synchronization. We talk about counterpoint. We talk in film contexts, as in narrative film context. Morning everyone. Maybe it's not morning. Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Knight Hill and I'm here to talk to you about my ideas of audiovisual space. This is a project that is currently in development. I've just been very fortunate enough to receive support from the AHRC to continue this research, so I will be working on this a lot more over the next 2 years. But I'm going... Morning everyone. Maybe it's not morning. Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Knight Hill and I'm here to talk to you about my ideas of audiovisual space. This is a project that is currently in development. I've just been very fortunate enough to receive support from the AHRC to continue this research, so I will be working on this a lot more over the next 2 years. But I'm going to just go over some of the ideas which I covered in the book chapter that I wrote for our recent Sound and Image Aesthetics and Practices volume, which has lots of other contributions from many of the other speakers at this event. Great, so we don't have much time, so let's dive straight in. So when we talk about audiovisuality, often what we're doing is we're conceptualizing the relationships between sound and image in temporal terms. We talk about points of synchronization. We talk about counterpoint. We talk in film contexts, as in narrative film context, about diegetic sound, which by its very definition is constructed through temporal congruence. But what I'm interested in is, does this actually reflect our true experience of the audiovisual work? How might thinking spatially contribute to our understandings of the audiovisual? And can spatial concepts reveal some unattended assumptions upon which certain theories are based? So I've been looking at a wide range of thinkers from film sound, electroacoustic music, sound arts, and experimental film. And I've come across lots of different perspectives which I think kind of try and weave this together. Here's an example. Kalanak quotes, "While the film was projected from the rear of the hall to the screen at the front, so music was projected backwards over the audience, and through a kind of transference or slippage between sound and image, the depth created by the sound is transferred to the surface of the image." So I really like this description of the physical experience of sitting in the cinema and how the light and the sounds combine together to create something that isn't just on that box at the front of the room, it's actually in the space. It is immersing the audience, completely surrounding them, and is something that's therefore not just tied to the image, which is of course one of the definitions that Michel Chillon talks about, how sound engenders the image, but everything therefore is defined by that frame and that image. And they're not the only one. Alexander Sasson says, "Film is something that we see. Things seen are necessarily spatial, but a film also provides its own space to replace that of our normal visual field. Only sight and hearing are fully active." So this is a space that's distinct from our real world spaces, and it has to be tactile, kinesthetic, and continuous. It's a space of experience. So these sounds and these images have to project themselves in such a way that they make up for those other sensory experiences which we are missing. So why am I interested in this idea of experience? You'll notice that both of the quotes that I just mentioned, they refer to this removal of the experience of audiovisuality from some abstract object to a kind of very human interaction. And this comes back to my question at the beginning of, how does this really relate to our experience? Because phenomenological space is not formalistic, but it's relational. So formalistic parameters are things that we can kind of scientifically quantify and define, and I've talked a lot previously about this idea that there's a very clear distinction between the physical signal and the perceived object. But it's very easy for us to get fixated on those physical signals because there's something that is other and that in a way we can kind of define and control a little bit more. So when we talk about formalist spatial audio parameters, we've got pitch space, we've got panoramic space, but those are, as I say, those are kind of things that we can stick numbers onto, and they're not really the kind of space that I'm talking about here. I mean, way back when I was doing my master's, I found this great quote from Condillac on his treatise on the sensations, and here in this quote from 1735, he talks all about this spatial experience of our world. "I open my eyes to the light, and at first I see only a maze of light and colour. I touch, I move forwards, I touch again, and as I look, the chaos insensibly clears. Touch, in some way, decomposes the light, separates the colours, distributes them among the objects, and detaches a clear space. Touch unfurls for them the universe. So, I'm interested in this idea of sound as a tactile material. Sound as the tool that reintroduces this sense of touch in the world to our experience when we're watching films, whether those are experimental visual music films or whether those are narrative films that we find in mainstream cinema. Okay, so we come to Deleuze and Guattari and their discussion of the distinction between smooth, continuous experience and the striation that we find around through so many of these formalistic principles. They say smooth is both the object of a close vision par excellence and the element of a haptic space, which may be as much visual or auditory as tactile. On the contrary, the striated relates to a more distanced visual and a more optical space. So they're talking here about how sound can actually open up this smooth continuity of experience, which contrasts with this temporal approach that separates things. If we come back to then ideas of how we think about sound and the relationship of materials, if we think about Smalley's spectral morphology, he talks about a continuum of gesture and texture. But actually, some of the ways that his ideas are expressed, formalized, can lead us to creating these two very distinct categories. So on the one hand, we have gesture, which is concerned with action, away from a previous goal towards a new goal. And in a sense, this is a striated form. So in A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari quote Boulez talking about the difference between striated and smooth, and he uses the example of striated space-time counts in order to occupy. So that's this then sense of kind of distance. We get an idea of a gesture moves from here to here, and that allows us to define a contained point in time. And that's contrasted with this idea of texture, which, as Smalley says, is concerned with internal behaviour patterns and is wrapped in contemplation. So Boulez says, smooth space-time one occupies without counting. So this is this idea that's coming through the spectrum morphology, this idea that something textural is something more immersive and it's closer to us. But of course, as I've said, Smalley is very clear to say that it's a continuum, but there's a danger in the way that he expresses these ideas, because it can be, as these ideas are digested, they can then become these two absolute categories. And of course, this idea of spatiality is a concept that Dennis Smalley has further developed, and he says space can become more significant than time, and time can be placed at the service of space rather than the reverse. So really what I'm interested in are these approaches. Often we find ourselves using these kind of temporal frames to discuss and to contextualize our audiovisual practice, but I feel like actually the experience of audiovisuality could be much more accurately reflected through spatial metaphors. Shaviro says, by entirely filling space, sound subverts the linear sequential order of narrative. In cinema, sound temporalizes the image, but in post-cinematic electronic and digital forms like music video, the sound works to release the image from the demands of linear narrative temporality. So if we're released from it, then why do we keep using these temporal concepts to frame what it is that we're doing? Structuralist assumptions of communication cast really long shadows over our research in audiovisuality. Key texts are often ocular-centric, and they construct these understandings around these striated layers of sound types and or narrative structures in the work. Such as, for example, Claudia Goldman's quote, "Music should subjugate itself to dialogue, to visuals, which are the primary vehicle of the narrative." So let's come back to this idea of perception and audiences. When we sit in a cinema, maybe not at the moment, but when we sit and we watch pieces, we don't often really conceptualize and think about the underlying ideas behind the pieces. We are experiencing the work as it comes to us, and then we may later reflect back on these concepts and processes that have created it. But, well, certainly for myself, when I'm experiencing a work, I am engaged in the sound and image and completely immersed in that experience. When I talk about taking over and thinking about spatially, I'm not saying that we should entirely reject the notion of time, because the two, of course, are absolutely interlinked. But what I'm talking about is this primacy of the temporal, which has so often been taken for granted in the way that we conceptualize and think about things. So Doreen Macy has written an amazing book on space. I think it's called For Space. And she talks about this idea of how within space actually distinct trajectories coexist. Without space there is no multiplicity, and without multiplicity there is no space. So actually this idea of spatiality also enables us to engage more openly with the subjectivity and flexibilities of interpretation that we come across, and which can be a real challenge if we are thinking about our work in limited temporal frames where, oh, it must mean this. Well, actually, spatial ways of thinking encourage this multiplicity and this openness of interpretation as an acceptable core thing in the work. Balzan, of course, says, "The meaning is not in the image, it is in the shadow of the image projected by montage onto the field of consciousness of the spectator." So what I'm thinking about then is this idea of a perceptual space, an audiovisual space which draws the audience into the filmic environment. And Nigel Thrift says this is a relational view of space, which rather than space being viewed as a container within which the world proceeds, space is seen as a co-product of those proceedings. So the audience observes the action of visual events on screen, and those of course are in relation to the spectral morphological events that envelop and surround the audience, and both together provide a space evoking either the abstract or the mimetic. So I'm not talking about a box and defining, saying, oh, this is a certain space, like Shion is with his frame. He's saying, there's a frame there and that everything is limited to that. I'm actually talking about the more expansive properties of this. And this is even before we get into things like expanded cinema and talking about removing the image from the screen itself. So I'm really interested in how these spatial concepts can afford new opportunities to conceptualize the audiovisual associations. Thinking spatially inherently integrates the audience as a key participant within the work, frames the communicative potential of the work in terms of the experiential, embodied, and the visceral. It foregrounds materials and materiality, and within a spatial framework of audiovisuality, the materials are no longer divided as, sound and image, but they're actively unified into an experiential whole. So, as I mentioned, this trajectory is only beginning. I'm very lucky to have support to continue this research over the next 2 years, and I look forward to sharing with you these ideas as they evolve and develop at future Seeing Sound events. As I said, if you're interested, you can check out our book, which has a chapter on this topic and lots of many other exciting things. There are 24 chapters in this book, all written by amazing people about a wide range of different practices. And of course, if you use the code SAI30, you will get 30% discount. So definitely, perfectly in time for Christmas. Amazing. Thank you guys so much. I look forward to the discussions and talking with you all very soon. Bye.
Hello, my name is Brian Dunphy. In this talk, I will discuss the Immerse AV toolkit and show you the immersive audiovisual composition, object number 3. The ImmerseAV toolkit consolidates my approach to audiovisual composition into a single purpose-built environment. It is written in C and C++. It currently runs on Mac OS and Windows. The tech stack used to build the toolkit includes OpenVR, Csound, OpenGL, and the interactive machine learning library RapidLib. The motivation for building this toolkit arose out of the desire to create audiovisual work in an environment that fosters the concept of giving equal importance to the generation and treatment of both audio and visual material. This was something I found lacking in environments such as Unity and Unreal. I felt that the Csound API would be a suitable audio engine as it provides access to Csound's vast library of opcodes and is easily embedded within a minimal C++ environment. The generation of visual material needed to be fast to keep up with real-time demands. This meant keeping the number of shader calls per frame to a minimum. The visual approach also needed to be capable of sufficient fluidity to allow for the exploration of complex abstract forms. For these reasons, I decided to focus on ray marching as the sole technique to generate visual material. The aim of ImmerseAV is to provide a focused, purpose-built environment for the creation of immersive abstract audiovisual art. Emerging from this, it was built from the start with two fundamental goals in mind: the ability to generate real-time material in well-defined contexts, and the ability to freely map data between these contexts. The use of Csound enables the creation of all audio processing within the combined orchestra and score file. This file is where the entire soundscape can be created. It then communicates with the Csound through the API, which runs on its own thread. The visual constraints ensure that all visuals are generated within a single frag shader that runs entirely on the GPU. This provides a conceptual counterpart to the audio context. The mapping of data between the senses is central to the practice of audiovisual composition. The mapping of data within the ImmerseAV toolkit takes place within a centralized studio class that provides access to sends and returns to and from Csound, uniforms to send data to the shader, a pixel buffer object to retrieve data asynchronously from the shader, the RapidLib neural network for the quick mapping of many parameters. So, to reiterate, in order to create a piece using the ImmerseAV toolkit, you write code in the following areas: the CSD file, the frag file, which is the frag shader, and the studio class. Within these files, you follow the following basic workflow. So create an audio patch in your CSD file. On the GitHub repository in the examples folder, you will see examples of the CSD files, frag files, and vert files. Vert files are the vertex shader and you do not need to write any code in here. All the audio is created in the CSD file. If I open it here, you can see Csound orchestra code and score code. In the frag file, you will see a ray marching algorithm implemented and all the lighting done within the same file. In addition to these two files, the studio class is found in the source code studio folder studio.cpp. The studio file is modeled on the open frameworks of app file, and as such is constructed using a setup function which initializes Csound, sets up any sends and returns. Here you also set up the ray marching quad and set up the machine learning processes. Before each frame is drawn, there is an update loop, an update function, and in the update function, you update audio sources and process data for mapping and interaction. Finally, you use the draw function to draw to screen. Below these three functions is machine learning functionality. The application is built and run from the terminal on macOS and from the command line on Windows. The capabilities for mapping data include creating audio reactive visuals, visually reactive audio, and simultaneous control of audio and visual material using a centralized data source. An interesting method for mapping emerged during the development of the system that I call cyclical mapping. This approach utilizes asynchronous readback of data from the fragment shader and sends that data to the inputs of the neural network. The output of the neural network is then sent to C-Sound. Audio data is then processed in C-Sound and returned to be sent as a uniform to the frag shader. The cycle then repeats. This technique results in randomized, unpredictable motion. The visuals drive the audio, which in turn drives the visuals. I am interested in further exploring this technique. Here I will show you an example of the technique in use. Once the model is running, you can see and hear erratic movement. The immersive audiovisual work, object number 3, demonstrates some of the potential of the toolkit and the approaches I've discussed. This piece uses the Mandelbrot formula to generate a complex and ambiguous visual form. The primary audio synthesis approach consists of a granular instrument in C-Sound. These two elements constitute the foreground material in the piece. I felt there were some conceptual correspondences between the self-similar characteristics of the Mandelbrot and the self-similar characteristics of the audio grains that comprise the sound world. When creating audiovisual work within a fully immersive context, I have found that it is essential to work with a third sense, that is the sense of presence. Without a convincing sense of presence within the virtual environment, the participant will be distracted from the interactions between the audio and visual material in the foreground. I found that I was able to create a sense of presence by striking a balance between realism and abstraction. The foreground material, the Mandelbrot and the granular synthesis, are completely abstract. However, the background material, the plane, lighting, and background audio were constructed to give the participant a sense of existing within a specific location. This allowed them to concentrate on interacting with the foreground material using the position and rotation of the controllers. Here is object number 3 being demonstrated at an event at Goldsmiths, University of London in February 2020. This is the first iteration of the ImmerseAV toolkit. There are many ways in which it can be improved and developed. Currently, the Studio class is buried within the structure of the toolkit. I would like to abstract this class and simplify the workflow. Perhaps the toolkit could be imported as a library, leaving the artist a minimal working directory with just a CSD, frag and Studio file. It is currently built using the OpenVR SDK, which is being phased out of use in favour of the OpenXR SDK. The use of OpenXR would open up the toolkit and allow it to be used with many of the most up-to-date headsets. OpenGL is no longer being supported by macOS in favour of Apple's proprietary Metal API. In light of this, I think Vulkan may be an interesting API to explore, as it is capable of running on macOS through Molten VK. It is also slightly lower level than OpenGL, so is potentially faster. I would like to expand the machine learning aspect of the toolkit to explore the potential for deep learning approaches to the generation and mapping of audiovisual material. I feel that this avenue of exploration could yield exciting results. In terms of audiovisual composition using the toolkit, I think the use of VR allows for the exploration of non-Euclidean spaces. I think it would also be interesting to integrate tactile feedback. These two elements could be fruitful and exciting directions to explore, and they could raise interesting compositional questions. Thank you very much for listening. The ImmerseAV Toolkit repository can be found at the following link. I'm excited to present this work to the community and would love to hear what you all think. I'm also open to suggestions for development and code contributions on GitHub. I would love to hear from you if you decide to use the framework for your own work. Finally, I would like to thank Joe Hyde for organising this event and bringing some much needed positivity to an unusual year. I hope you enjoy the rest of Seeing Sound 2020.
I'd like to thank Joe and all of you in Bath and elsewhere who worked so hard to make Seeing Sound 2020 happen under these challenging circumstances. I'm honored to be a part of it. In 1923, the literary and art critic Willard Huntington Wright published a small book titled The Future of Painting. It opens with this: that a grave misconception attaches to the art of modernist painting should be evident from the bitter warfare which for over a century has raged between the advocates of the older painting and the exponents of the new. Never before in the history of art has there existed so violent and prolonged a controversy concerning the merits and demerits of opposing aesthetic procedures. Practically the entire artistic world is divided into two hostile camps with diametrically opposed doctrines and beliefs. After describing the effect on critics and the rest of the art world, Wright noted that even the layman, usually a silent and indifferent spectator to the clashes of aesthetic partisanship, has taken a hand and expressed his opinion in no uncertain terms. That the controversy still plays out is reflected in this recent New Yorker cartoon by Harry Bliss and Steve Martin. While the art of color sprang from and grew out of the art of painting, it was in reality an independent organism. Its evolution, instead of being a direct progressus, was in the nature of a differentiation. This differentiation had been underway for a little over a century. Here's how Wright summarized it. Turner sought to heighten the intensity of color. Delacroix strove to develop the dramatic possibilities of color. Cézanne carried his research in the optics of chromatic gradations to a point where he was able to determine the active functions of color. The Impressionists endeavored to solve the problem of light and vibration. The Pointillists carried the science of color juxtaposition and the interactivity of complementarities to a coldly intellectual extreme. Gauguin worked exclusively in the decorative values of pure color. Matisse devoted himself to the harmonic relationships of color. The Cubists sought to eliminate objectivity the essence of painting, and to achieve form by intersecting tonal planes. And the synchronous color coordinated and rationalized the palette. The synchronous painter Stanton MacDonald Wright was Willard's younger brother and played a considerable role in shaping the arguments in the future of painting. Both he and his colleague Morgan Russell experimented with light as a medium. Here's a 1916 example from Russell. Over time, their experiments grew increasingly elaborate, as is seen in this 1969 project of MacDonald Wright's. Willard Wright steps away from his opposing camps theme to look at the new art's purpose and methods. This new art of color is striving for an intensity of effect which the older painting does not possess. The world today demands more powerful aesthetic stimuli than it did in the past. It is a highly intensified emotional stimulant, a stimulant, in fact, whose very intensity is its raison d'etre. It is distracting and absorbing, and when successfully conceived and executed, fixes the attention and produces a positive and poignant reaction, both intellectual and emotional. Wright is clear that the medium in which the art of color will be fully realized will be light, which he describes as color in its purest, most intense form. He wonders that artists did not come to it sooner. And he is also clear that where painting was a decorative art, the art of light will be a performative art. He identified two extant projects that merited mention, even if somewhat dismissively. The first was to Alexander Wallace Remington's color organ, which he called too limited for anything approaching aesthetic composition. And the mention of Thomas Wilford's organ is recognized as a decided advance over any of the others. He then turns to the future. The color instrument of the future will not merely throw pretty squares, circles, coils, and volutes of colored light on a screen, but will be able to record the artist's moods, desires, and emotion along any visually formal aesthetic line. Only when such an instrument has been perfected can the modern artist's creative conceptions be properly expressed. Beyond having the right instrument, though, Wright asserted that the artist will require proper discipline, grounded in the principles of form and organization which animate all great painting. To explicate, he turned to 5th century art theorist Hsi Ho. The canons of art were 6 guidelines provided by Hsi Ho, the first of which was rhythmic vitality. I've consulted a variety of sources to articulate the canons, so some of this goes beyond what Wright has in his text. Rhythmic vitality is widely recognized to speak to the life moving through the work, the artist's nervous energy. Organic structure is the brushwork with its combinations of strong and light, thick and thin, wet and dry. Conformity, the nature, is the object as you, the artist, know it, not merely as a photographic. This one is not in Wright's list, interestingly, suitability to type. And when one looks around, you learn that it really had to do with the application of color, which is true to the nature of the object. Again, not necessarily photographic. And it's interesting that it's not in Wright's list, given that color is so central to his argument. This may be due to his arguing that color has only recently become prominent in the graphic arts. Arrangement is the using of space much as objects are used. And then finally, transmission of classic models is learning through inheritance and by copying, learning from the artists who preceded you. The Future of Painting, which was Wright's first serious work in 6 years, had been a hard book to finish for him, and he worried that it would be dismissed with its conclusions taken too narrowly. His publisher only printed 2,000 copies. Still, he wrote in a letter to a friend about the book, friend Burton Roscoe, that I want it to stand as a kind of prophecy. The Future of Painting was not a perfect book, nor Wright nor was Wright a perfect scholar or perfect man, but I think that it meets the goal he set for himself in writing it. I think it does function as a kind of prophecy, as well as a guidepost for us now. With that, we turn to the current project. The design brief for Imager calls for creating a visual synthesizer that is able to record the artist's moods, desires, and emotions along any visually formal aesthetic line. Design the design of the instrument so that it can be used for improvisation as well as for composed works. Design it to be self-sufficient, yet open to music controllers and graphic systems. Use the building of the instrument to explore contemporary programming, instrument design, and ideas in the history and theory of visual music. These are some of those ideas. Thomas Wilford's color, form, and motion model of Lumia, which remains among the strongest platforms for organizing an art that has a dimensionality at least as complex as that of music. Stanton MacDonald Wright's chromatic scales, which he designed specifically to address the musical ideas of harmony and dissonance. Thomas Cole's diagram of contrasts. Cole was a leader of the Hudson Valley School of Realism, and this diagram is unlike anything else that he painted. In 1834, he made this entry in his diary. I made a small circular diagram of colors today. It reminded me of an experiment I have long wished to try and have thought a good deal about. The idea was suggested by something I read when a boy. I do not know where. It is what may be called the music of colors. With this painting, Cole has addressed the issue of color purity often raised by artists working in the art of light. John Whitney's rule of harmonic procession. Applying a simple rule of motion to a collection of basic geometric forms, such as hexagons, produces a predictable and satisfying pattern of change in time. Watching its result, Whitney noted, "We have created expectations, and there is some pleasure to be had when expectations are satisfied. This is the simplest way I've found," he said, "to show idea becoming feeling. You don't need to count the hexagon groups to experience a kind of anticipation, a joy of recognition, to feel something vicariously akin to a rival home when all of them align." He points out the fact that Pythagoras had described the nature of harmonic relationships for subsequent musicians, and he was proposing that there may be a visual domain of harmonic relations to match Pythagoras' grammar of music. Carl Gerstner's correspondences, which I have spoken and written about at length elsewhere, and Pask's aesthetically potent environments. In an article in which the great cybernetician Gordon Pask theorizes about the music color machines that he and Mackinnon Wood devised, he wrestled with how to guide the development of environments that would foster pleasurable interactions. He characterized these environments as aesthetically potent environments, and they had several features. One is that they possess sufficient variety to provide potentially controllable novelty. Think of a piano, which is approachable and yet allows you to do so very much. That they use forms that are interpretable at various levels of abstraction. That they provide cues that guide learning, and that they are responsive and adaptive so as to engage players in conversation. While this last feature is one that Pask saw as optional, it is also more clearly within our grasp given reactive computing and advances in artificial intelligence. Behind these ideas, the Imager project starts with several assets. The development environments around iPad is at a really interesting place. Swift UI and Combine support declarative and reactive programming paradigms that seem ideally suited to the demands of instrument design. And Metal provides for world-class 3D rendering on millions of inexpensive devices. The Imager prototype is written in Objective-C. In addition to being burdened with a great deal of code debt, it makes no use of shaders, 3D models, lighting models, or camera motion models. Its variety is entirely the result of applying painterly tricks and techniques to very simple geometric structures. This has been useful for exploring the canons of art, but it also suggests that there is a good deal of upside yet to be realized. Here is a brief clip wherein I played Imager to respond to a rhythmic improvisation. Throughout 2019, we invited a dozen small groups of artists, musicians, designers, and teachers to play with Imager prototypes. About half of them put their hands on and described that as fun. Most of the others said that watching it was engaging. Many added that they would enjoy more time with it and would like to have an app. This clip shows Catherine Butler, an artist and teacher, during her first hour improvising with the Imager prototype. Looking to engage with others in a learning community, I've produced a plan. And finally, to return one last time to the future of painting. Near the end of the book, which I will recall for you was written exactly a century ago, Wright wrote, "The art of color will be a new art only in medium. And until a day comes when an artist is great enough to express the profound form of a Rubens or a Michelangelo or a Beethoven through this modern medium of light, the art of color will remain inferior to other arts. That day may not come for many decades, perhaps for a century." As a past editor of the International Journal of Forecasting, I must observe that this is not bad at all as socio-technical forecasts go. Thank you for your interest and for listening.
I'd like to start with this map of the United States in the pin drop of Cherokee, Iowa. Cherokee is my hometown as well as Ben's hometown, where he spent his entire career as an electronic abstractionist and commercial artist. Ben's location in the rural Midwest made written correspondence imperative to furthering his ideas and opportunities. This prolific level of written correspondence, coupled with Ben's own archival aptitude, has provided me with a wealth of insight into his artistic process. Although in relative cultural isolation, Ben remained in regular rapport with some of the leading minds of his time. Ben lived in the same apartment almost all of his adult life. Pictured as the apartment building where all of his major discoveries occurred. An entirely self-taught mathematician, draftsman, and commercial artist, Ben's interest in higher education was thwarted by the Great Depression in the 1930s. However, his erudition had already started modulating the paths of interest in math, art, and nature. An idea that Ben's colleague from MIT, Yorgi Keeps, would later call interthinking and interseeing. This slide is from an essay that was written for the Leonardo Journal in 1978 titled Magic Squares, a Design Source. Ben addressed the origin story of his electronic abstractions by detailing his analysis of magic square constant summation line tracings. Magic squares have appeared throughout civilization for thousands of years, and line tracings were often done for occult purposes, such as for the creation of sigils. One of the most famous magic squares appears in Albrecht Dürer's engraving Melancholia I. Its numerous summation patterns of 34 have been documented extensively. Ben created hundreds of his own magic squares and mathematical puzzles throughout the 1930s and 40s. Many were published for the popular syndicated Ripley Believe It or Not newspaper panel over a period of 25 years. This is an example of a mathematical puzzle of Ben's that was published for Ripley. Ben fully explored magic squares, often using different shapes and even venturing into the third and fourth dimensions. The following pages are notes of his analysis of magic square line tracings, which he began in the early 1930s. One can see Ben exhausting all the possible geometric patterns from a fifth-order magic square, utilizing various groups beyond just summation. This image is from the same Leonardo essay illustrating the kinds of patterns that could be created from taking the line tracings a step further into the design realm. Ben was also an avid microscopist, learning the snowflake capturing technique from correspondence with famed weather scientist Dr. Vincent Schaefer. Ben contributed an article to the Micronotes Journal detailing this process and highlighted a few of the tricks he had devised himself for a successful capture and preservation. One can see the symmetry and natural beauty of these frozen microscopic patterns. In the 1940s, Ben began exploring the use of pendulum tracing machines and harmonographs to actualize his idea of what he coined the triangle of form. A letter to the Micronotes editor in 1949 discusses this relationship. Ben states, "There is a triangular relationship which exists between mathematics, art forms, especially in design, and natural forms. Mathematics furnishes geometric figures, polyhedra, curves of all types, serial rhythms, and other ideas. In nature, we have, of course, crystals, flowers, plants, and microscopical objects such as diatoms, radiolaria, foraminifera, as well as other forms. From both of these apices, we can draw to derive inspiration for design and art. It is this triangle of form which is my object of study and research." In 1947, Ben encountered an article in Popular Science magazine that proposed the use of TV testing equipment such as oscilloscopes to generate simple decorative patterns based on similar math that governs pendulum curves. The kinetic mechanical possibilities of his harmonographic and pendulum experimentation did not reveal new aesthetic forms for him, so Ben knew entering into this new paradigm of the analog electronic would allow for a new visual language to unfold. He became his own engineer, learning how to build the necessary equipment by reading the trade magazines, Radio and Television News, and Radio Electronics. Early radios and televisions used components that required servicing on an annual basis, so these types of publications were prominent and popular. A significant portion of these publications addressed the service industry, providing schematics and parts suppliers. This is an early press shot of Ben demonstrating a simple abstract form on one of his oscilloscopes. Ben's equipment began with devices utilizing standard schematics, but progressed into custom circuits as his knowledge of how to conduct the cathode ray tube's electron beam expanded. My grandfather, Ray, worked closely with Ben to construct camera mounting systems that would allow for the best capture of the oscilloscope screen. Ben was already an avid photographer prior to his oscillonic work, so developing and printing the oscillons was a fluid part of his workflow. Ben began this oscillonic work in 1950. 2 years later, he had photographed thousands of non-objective abstract forms. From over 6,000 of these oscillons, a collection of 50 black and white images were exhibited. The Sanford Museum in Cherokee held the debut exhibition in 1953. Electronic abstractions, a new approach to design, garnered local acclaim and interest and soon traveled out of the Midwest to the larger cultural centers, both domestically and internationally. This next group of slides is documentation of the debut exhibition at the Sanford Museum. This is a small selection of the original black and white oscillons that were exhibited. These next few oscillons were recently discovered. They date from 1953 and show that Ben had begun to explore the use of color in the oscillonic forms by painting directly on his black and white prints. Several techniques were attempted to render the oscillons in color. The most effective technique involved the use of a color wheel rotating at a certain RPM between the camera lens and the oscilloscope screen. This technique had been invented by CBS for the earliest color television sets. Ben used the standard RGB color wheel and also experimented with various combinations of color filters. From the mid-1950s to the end of that decade, he experimented and photographed thousands of color oscillons. In 1960, the Sanford Museum debuted this new color collection, Dynamic Light Forms for the Space Age. The next set of slides is a small preview of the color oscillons. Throughout the 1960s, Ben continued to show his oscillons and license images for commercial purposes. He continued to experiment with different ways in which to modulate the waveform. Some experiments involved connecting his turntable to the system and using the audio signal to generate oscillonic forms directly pushed by the music. He had spent some time visiting artists on the East Coast, like Mary Ellen Butte, and was inspired by her work's direct connection to the dynamics of music. Ben also began filming the oscillons in 16mm as they were being created, but did not have the necessary means to continue with this new pursuit. At this point, almost $10,000 had been spent on building his custom system and darkroom facility. This would amount to around $90,000 today. An opportunity did arise for collaboration with Experiments in Art and Technology, a nonprofit started by Bell Labs engineers and the artist Robert Rauschenberg. EAT was most well known for their series of 9 evenings performances in 1966. EAT had welcomed Ben as a member in 1968 and exhibited oscillons in their group shows. They also facilitated collaboration around the U.S. between artists and engineers who were located in the same region. But a letter detailing the fact that they had no liaisons within a feasible distance of Cherokee, Iowa, was very telling. Ben would remain his own engineer. By the 1970s, computer art had shifted into the digital realm. The oscillons didn't appear in any new advertising or commercial applications. Ben's health and finances severely slowed down any new studio explorations of applying the oscillonic forms to new media. The oscillons would continue to be published in an art historical context, often appearing in the first few pages of computer art compilations, such as this one from Ruth Leavitt's Artist and Computer. Over the past 10 years, there's been a renewed interest in Ben's work. With the resurgence of modular synthesis as a means to create electronic music and visuals away from the digital realm, a new generation is discovering the forefathers of analog signal paths. In 2015, Scottish sound and visual artist Mark Lycan premiered an audiovisual performance called Oscillon Response, which used similar techniques to Ben's to create oscillography and music simultaneously. I see this as a continuation of Ben's creative lineage, as Ben always imagined having his work unfold in real time for the viewer and listener, but was never able to actualize this idea. I've known the composer and artist Robert Aiki Aubrey-Lowell for many years, but it wasn't until I mentioned my Uncle Ben's custom analog systems in passing one day that Robert made the connection that Ben and I were related. Robert is well known in the modular synth community, and in 2016 he organized the Machines and Music Festival that took place around Brooklyn. I was invited to give a short talk on Ben's work, and a collection of original Oscillons that I'd inherited were displayed at the festival and then later at the Control Mod Synth Shop in Williamsburg. In 2017, Robert curated a nested exhibition called Subject to Gesture, which was a part of the Museum of Art and Design's larger exhibition, Sonic Arcade, Shaping Space with Sound. Sonic Arcade was a multi-component exhibition that explored how the ephemeral and abstract nature of sound is made material. A small grouping of Ben's Oscillons were selected by Robert from the Sanford Museum's archive. Subject to Gesture's focus was on visual music and the interactive gestural aspect of analog synthesis, a perfect place for the Oscillons to be experienced. Thank you to the Seeing Sound Festival for this opportunity to share my research for the forthcoming book. Please drop me a line if you'd like to be notified when it is ready for sale. Special thanks to Linda Burkhart and the Sanford Museum in Cherokee for the continued support of my book research. I'd like to leave you all with a brief slideshow of Ben's Oscillons.
Hello, my name is Trent Kim and I'm a Lumia artist and researcher. I have divided my presentation into two sections. Firstly, introduction to Lumia and my PhD research. Secondly, comparative analysis and my experiments to discuss the structure of Lumia composition. Lumia is a little known art form that emerged in the interwar period in the US and used light as a sole medium of expression. A Danish-born American artist, Thomas Wilfred, devoted most of his career to developing this new independent art form until his death in 1968. He was still working on his new artwork, Opus 162 Ducata, and went on a radio show called Patricia Marx Interviews to reiterate his vision of Lumia. Despite all his effort, the discourses around Lumia still fail to explain what Lumia is, how it is an independent art form, and how it progresses. And I believe that we haven't progressed from or even maintained the infancy stage that Wilfred used to describe Lumia of his time. Lumia appears in various literature across different fields and is a term frequently used to describe visual effects achieved by reflection and refraction of light. A simple technical principle resulting in complex looks meant many discovered the method by accident and looked for a word to describe this great effects afterwards. The use of reflection and refraction of light is something that most artists who are interested in light experiment with. So it is possible to curate Lumia purely by pulling similar looks and setups without a critical discourse. In addition, those who are genuinely interested in discovering and theorizing about Lumia tend to recite Wilfred's words and phrases without truly making sense of them, or even poeticize his text to philosophize and historicize the art form. Neither of the approaches truly validates the original intent of Lumia as an independent art form which should be timeless, inspiring, progressive, and most importantly, operative. But instead, Lumia has become a historical artifact that is often mystified and taken out of its context to suit other art historical writings. The knowledge of Lumia is subjugated, and the discourses around Lumia scattered and fragmented in various sources. And even Wilfred's own texts and speeches are arguably influenced by the established regimes of thought of his time. And the series of alternative labels given to Lumia, such as color music, projected scenery, early cinema, intermedia, conceptual art, or light show technique, are evidence to prove this. Why can Lumia be the independent art form of light as intended? According to Foucault, a regime of truth operates a discourse, and therefore one must question the relationship between power and knowledge. Subjugated knowledge for Foucault meant historical contents that have been embodied and disguised in a functionalist coherence or formal systemization, and knowledge disqualified as inadequate to their task or insufficiently elaborated, hence naive knowledge. Wilfred used the word infancy to describe Lumia even after a half-century of his innovations and development. And I argue that it is another evidence to highlight the toxic environment for Lumia to survive and grow. Eskilsson's writing on Lumia and intermedia is an interesting observation that can describe how Lumia had to be seen as complicit to the established regimes by avoiding the confrontations to their hypothesis while being in between. But then I questioned whether that strategy was one of the reasons to have led the end of Lumia. So far in my PhD research, I have gathered various discourses on Lumia and critically analyzed to reveal the subjugated knowledge as part of my literature review, and have brought the knowledge back to the community of Lumia and have initiated various projects to help construct a positive discourse of Lumia for it to return to practice and continue discovering itself as an independent art form of light so that it can inform a broad range of contemporary practices. Here's a diagram to briefly show my methodological design. I have adopted Fairclough's critical discourse analysis and Levi Strauss' concept bricolage to create this cycle of discourse renewal. In a way, my research paradigm is inspired by both post-structuralism and structuralism to situate my practice and community of practice at the core. In my latest experiment, I wanted to focus on the structural schema of Lumia to compare and contrast with distinctive structures of other art forms. Wilfred often compared Lumia to music to defend itself from being understood as a form of musical experiment like color music of his time, but also in a metaphoric manner. For instance, his adaptation of sonata form into his Lumia experiment, which he described as unsuccessful, is a good example. On the other hand, his discussions on unearthly phenomena in nature experienced by humans help us understand what he refers to as closed competition. Wilfred's tone is meditative and cynical at the same time. For instance, he emphasized the importance of peace of mind and silence in meaningful contemplations, yet he acknowledges that nature is disinterested in what we do. Waiting for Godot addresses the meaning and purpose of human existence through the act of waiting. Godot represents the irreducible uncertainty of being human And through this lens of absurdity, we are reminded of how we live, have lived, and will live. The short dialogue resembles the binary between meditation and cynicism found in Wilfred's worldview, and it is easy to identify the cyclic pattern with variations found in the structures of Theatre of Absurd and Lumia. Yet what fundamentally differentiates the two is, unlike Waiting for Godot, Lumia occupies Godot. Arguably, it materializes Godot by revealing the unearthly space as a counter space to the natural and physical world. And it is the reducible void that exists between material presence. For example, space between two people, a person and an animal, a person and a tree, or between rocks. Materializing the void is what light does, although we are less familiar with it, as we believe light functions to show what we want to see by illuminating things and projecting an image of things. As things are never still, light animates and performs the void. In my analog Lumia work, I have used a vacuum packaging technique to think about this anti-space that Lumia acquires. Asked dancers to wear a reflective foil in a performance and digitally reimagined body as potential void. This particular work, Lucky Speech, translated a character's body from an old theater production of Waiting for Godot into 3D data and transformed it into a kinetic lens. In Optics 3, Magnetic Plastics, as the title suggests, I experimented with magnets. What it has revealed was how the connectedness between my hands and those magnetic pins molds this void. And it doesn't matter whether we are individually intact, because we are always connected by the void. It is useful to compare the role of Lumia composer to the active role of narrator found in Brecht's epic theater. Epic theater draws a clear distinction between stage and audience, and it deliberately alienates spectators through the division to ensure the necessary critical distance. Brecht famously said how art is not a mirror to reflect reality, but a hammer with which to shape it. In comparison to epic theater, Lumia seeks to form a window to the void, and there is no division between Lumia and spectators, as we are already there, only without realizing. Aside from comparative analysis between Lumia and other art forms, I tried to adapt the structure of Lumia into sound as a reversed attempt to color music. The idea was also inspired by Dr. Dave Paling's work on Wilfred's composition theory of Lumia into sound work. This small experiment began by sketching and notating my composition ideas, which was not imagery output, but a composition and operation of individual parts. The Western musical notation offers a platform to visualize the structure of music by notating values of individual instrumental outputs through vertical and horizontal axes. Although it does not describe the overall collective output, it facilitates the intermediary stage between instruments and performance by notating the structure. Lumia traditionally relies on repetition of individual parts, and the variations occur as discussed earlier. So I have treated an octave as a cycle and used lines and shapes to symbolize the structure of Lumia rather than signifying musical values or gestures. Limiting visual elements almost as a metaphoric foreign medium was very helpful, and so was treating an octave as a pure dimensional cycle. Each interval was treated as a side of a shape in this imagined notation. So for example, C to C is a line. C to E to G sharp to C becomes a triangle. I have used an online MIDI sequencer to experiment with this, and this is what it looks like and sounds like. And this one shows the structural logic behind, as well as my simple imagery notation below. Yet this experiment did not fully benefit from the structure of Lumia, as I was already treating it as melody and harmony. So I wanted to bring more spatial dimensions by using an ambisonic sound editing, incorporating Oculus Rift S, DRVR, Spatial Connect, and Reaper. This is an excerpt from the experiment showing how I extracted, slowed down, and repeated a shower water drip sound and a footstep sound, and then spatially animated those sounds to amplify the sense of void, which isn't just silence. In this experiment, I experienced a sense of carnivalesque, for instance, being lost in the chaos, while witnessing individual parts replacing the whole in subversion. And yet, it wasn't either the collective or sculpted object of noise. However, what it revealed is the relationality between those sounds as individual parts that began promoting the shape of void, and I made a short animation to express this concept. In the lens of Lumia, the void completes our understanding of the natural world, and nothing disappears to non-existence. This void holds our loss and potential gains, memories and lost memories, and past and future. Materializing the immaterial space of the universe has been the medium of life's main duty, and Lumia as an independent art form claims the space to reveal the world to us in a way that we do not naturally discover. Therefore, I argue that Lumia without light can become a unique narrative structure for the diverse practices that animate and perform. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. My name is Brian McKenna. Thanks for having me. Today I want to talk about some video synthesis work that I've been doing. Here is a HD synchronizer, and the work here is a PCB, and it's in the form of a do-it-yourself project, and it's a original design and open source, so I want to talk about that a bit today. I have made a website with lots of information, and so here's a built version. It's a built version as a standalone unit, and this is a Eurorack version. that'll fit into a rack, and then you have VGA output, RGB input, and then there's two more outputs, and they can essentially be whatever you want, but it's default configured for synchronization, horizontal and vertical. It generates sync, but importantly, this project generates blanking signals. So if you start experimenting with analog video, at a certain level, when you're removed from video mixers and time-based correctors, it's pretty much a given that your blanking signals will be missing or corrupted. And this presents a number of problems because missing blanking information, it's just a big limitation. You can get unwanted intensity shifts in the brightness of the image, and flat panel displays and projectors. They can be really picky, and they just drop your signal. And analog to digital converters, like what you might use to record videos that you're making, these are not going to work properly if you don't have the correct blanking information. So yeah, you need blanking, and the timing has to be good enough, and when that's there, you can be free to experiment, and you don't have to dance around this sort of loss of signal issue so much. So I just wanted to make something easy and analog and adaptable to a lot of situations, and so that's what this circuit does. It generates the horizontal and vertical synchronization pulses, and then this timing is used to generate blanking signals. And then these blanking signals are inserted into your video inputs before they get sent to the display. This is a self-printed version of this. I started building up. It's a lot of work to do etching and drilling holes, but I just wanted to make sure that this PCB design would be self-printable, so that the traces are not too small and the holes are not too small, so that you can fabricate one yourself if you wanted to do that. This is a early kind of sketched up prototype here. This one doesn't do blanking, but would generate a simple test pattern. And so here you can see there is a quartz crystal here that is divided down with a binary ripple counter. And from that you get your horizontal synchronization pulse. The frequency divider output also goes to a divide by n counter, so there we can choose how to divide the clock. We have 67.5 kilohertz horizontal frequency and 60 hertz vertical frequency. So if we want to change some of these settings, for example the divide by frequency, we can just change the number there. So now we have a vertical frequency of 41.5 and 36, 35. So this is what we use to program the divide by number of the divide by n counter. I've mapped out a number of formats. So this is 1080p 60, otherwise known as format 16. There's some data on that, and then importantly for using this circuit we have settings. So likewise, if we want to change the horizontal frequency, we can change the jumpers here. So let's move this jumper over. Now we have 33.75, and so that, that's half of 1080p 60. So we could run 1080p 30 from that. I'll try another one here. So 135 kilohertz. So you get the idea. And the divide by n counter, we can also change jumpers for that. So do different multiples here. So I was running at 120 hertz, which is, it's a strange format, but some professional equipment does accept that. 1080p 120 and 240. Some displays might not be able to do that. Most can't, I'm sure. So here we can fine-tune the crystal a bit. So if I tune this around, we can push the frequency closer to 59.94, which is more like a broadcast standard. It's 29.97 frames. These components are in charge of, this is a blanking for horizontal, this is blanking for vertical, and this is the pulse widths of the synchronization pulses. So basically you choose a resistance and a capacitance value, and that sets the timing. And so I've got some recipes here for, so R1 1.2K, 0.1 nanofarads, and that changes the horizontal sync width. If you want to be super precise, you can add these trim pots here, and then you can measure with the frequency counter. If you don't want to install those, you can just put a little jumper wire here, and that also works fine. But extra level of precision, not a bad thing for certain uses. Composite sync's pretty easy to make out of horizontal and vertical sync, but I don't really have space for doing that on this PCB, so you know, and it is kind of an option. But if, for example, you got like a bunch of old Sony PVM monitors and you want to run those at PAL or NTSC or even HD in the case of the HD capable CRT monitors, or you know, the broadcast monitors, which are LCD screens, you would need composite sync. So I just made that in this case by working with these pin headers here, and then added some BNC connectors. So basically, I'll show this a bit closer here. So this pin header here is carrying the red, green, and blue, and this one is carrying the blanking, and the 5-volt power and ground goes through these headers as well. And then I've just got like it's a HCT86, and it's like a XOR, so I just make the composite sync from that, and it works fine with Sony monitors. I had two connectors here just because I wasn't sure for each different format if you were going to need a negative composite sync or positive composite sync, so I just put both. I'm interfacing with this very cheap but decent quality VGA to HDMI adapter. What you can do to test things out, make some test patterns, is get some of these little jumper wires. There we got some red, now we got some green for the sake of a test pattern. And blanking width for horizontal would normally be a 10K resistor, but here I've put a little potentiometer in there, and then I can show you how we can just change the blanking to blank the whole screen, half the screen. This one has a little power output, so the power is getting regulated in here, and then the same power is going to this breadboard for a breadboard sketch. And the power consumption is pretty low, so if you compare it to like a Raspberry, it's a lot lower. And I measured this setup with 4 video outputs and a lot of ICs here, driving 4 monitors, and it didn't really use that much power. I don't remember the number now, but this voltage regulator, it can handle 1.5 amps, and it was nowhere near that, so it barely got warm. You don't need a heatsink or anything.
One thing that's interesting about this forehead version, and I'll try to show this somehow, but the circuit's pretty busy on the top because that's where you get all the synchronization and all the blanking going on, but for each section, I don't know if you can see that too well, it's a bit dark. There we go. So for each section, I mean, these PCBs are almost empty because all you need is the blanking switch, because all the timing's already been generated. So that's pretty handy. You know, if you want to make a multi-screen installation, you can share the synchronization from one PCB with the other PCBs. And yeah, so here it's only using the blanking chip. There it is. And I'll show some footage of what I used this for. It was a 4-monitor installation.
This is quite a elaborate and complicated looking schematic. The core of the circuit is really quite simple.
Hi, my name's Derek Holzer. On behalf of myself, Ivan Marusich-Cliff, and Chris King, I'd like to present to you Vector Hack. In October of 2020, the second edition of the Vector Hack Festival took place in Croatia and Slovenia. Vector Hack is dedicated to experimental vector graphics. The event was a combination of community meeting, conference, and international arts festival. It brought together practitioners in the field of laser and oscilloscope art for talks, workshops, and live performances. It featured researchers, developers, and performers from around the world, as well as those from the strong regional scene of Italy, Austria, and Croatia. The festival combined both remote and local activities as a response to the ongoing global pandemic. Physically, Vector Hack was split between 3 cities. Rijeka, as part of the European Cultural Capital of 2020, Ljubljana, in collaboration with the Ludmila Arts Organization, and Dubrovnik, in collaboration with Art Radionica Lazaretti. The event was also accessible online with web-stream performances, screenings, presentations, and panel discussions, which have all been archived on the Vector Hack YouTube channel. So what are experimental vector graphics? These are images created using a single point moving along an X, Y, and Z coordinate system. Often, but not always, they're audiovisual performances where the same signal which draws the image can also be heard through the speakers. They can also be line drawings, produced in real time by a number of electronic and mechanical means. To display them, we use tools like lasers, analog oscilloscopes, old video game consoles, and mechanical drawing machines. To create the signals, we often use elaborate handmade electronic synthesizers, complex custom-made software, or other experimental instruments, often of the artist's own design. There's always an emphasis on live, improvisational, and generative elements, and often a direct relationship between the sound and the image. Sometimes there's a media archaeological element in the use of unusual analog or sometimes obsolete display technologies. And the resulting images are always radically different from what you would see on a digital screen. Vector Hack has always been interested in exploring the roots of video and computer art. We hosted several presentations to illustrate the connection of artists working in the mid-20th century with works by a new generation, featured in our program. Francesca Franco's Algorithmic Signs focused on her exhibition of 5 early computer artists: Ernest Edmonds, Manfred Mohr, Vera Molnar, Frieder Nacke, and Roman Verostko. Scooby Lepowski presented his research into Ben Lepowski's pioneering electronic abstractions, using the analog oscilloscope to create imagery during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Benjamin Heidersberger discussed his father Heinrich Heidersberger's rhythmograms, which used moving pendulums in the 1950s to create photographic vector art long before digital computers. We also wanted to foreground a connection to local history. Tomislav Mikulic, a Croatian member of the New Tendencies movement, described his evolution from computer plotter drawings to cutting-edge computer animations in the 1970s and 80s. While Miha Vipotnik introduced us to the early computer and video art happening in Slovenia. VectorHack benefits from a huge international community of artists pushing the medium of experimental vector graphics, and we invited several of them to inform us about their research. James Nolan Gandy presented visual representations of mechanical harmony with his fascinating hand-engineered drawing machines. Bernd Ullmann introduced us to depictions of chaos using contemporary analog computers from his company Analog Paradigm. Stephanie Breuer and Ted Davis shared their research into the affordances of using cheap USB sound cards as digital-to-analog converters for oscilloscope art. Andre J. offered his DIY audiovisual synthesizer Phosform, which was used by participants in a workshop in Rijeka. Paloma Kopp showed a number of experimental projects from her master's thesis work at Alfred University under the title Modulating Material. Tadej Drolc discussed composing with audiovisual gestalts in the context of his laser performances. Christopher Short demonstrated the Radiator, a standalone laser synthesizer which draws on the history of laser consoles dating back to the Laserium shows of the 1970s.
When you go to recolor it, you got more points to hang your colors
And
on.
James
So if
Lehman
I say one,
walked us through the
it looks a lot
concepts of
more
Laser Boy,
smooth
a unique free software for the creation of laser imagery.
vector is a little bit smaller, so you get more color, you get more resolution of color, so to speak.
We were also very happy to invite two different artists to create ongoing public artwork installations. Alberto Novello, who you saw in the beginning of the presentation, set up a kiosk outdoors in Rijeka to allow people to interactively use his laser to draw on public monuments. And Evan Henry sent us a beautiful series of Polaroids, which he had captured from the screen of his Vectrex game console. And of course, Vector Hack wouldn't be a festival without screenings. And performances. There's certainly already been a lot of interest to do another Vector Hack again in 2 more years. We haven't committed to making it a Vector Biennale so far, but I suppose we could be open to anything. A personal interest of my own would be to make it into something which has a peer-reviewed component, considering that I'm getting more into doing PhD studies and hopefully some sort of teaching work after that. The ability to be able to publish peer-reviewed conference articles out of Vector Hack would be something that would be personally very interesting for me, and it's something that I think I'd like to look for partners for in the next 2 years to help work out if we do this again. I'd like to thank Joe Hyde for also his contributions to the Vector Hack, as well as for arranging Seeing Sound and accepting our humble proposal of this short presentation. And I thank you all for your kind attention. See you later.